I'm Dan Torello with the Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. Welcome to Kluge Book Conversations. I'm here today with Dr. Valentine Moghadam and Dr. Shamiran Mako, the co-authors of After the Arab Uprisings, Progress and Stagnation in the Middle East and North Africa, which was published this year by Cambridge University Press. Dr. Moghadam is professor of sociology and international affairs at Northeastern University. Previously, among other roles, she was section chief for gender equality and development at UNESCO in Paris. And at the Kluge Center, she currently holds the chair in Countries and Cultures of the South. Dr. Mako, her co-author, is assistant professor of international relations at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. Val, Shamiran, great to see you today. Thanks for being with us. Let's start with a little bit of history. Tell us about your background and some of your experience and how it is that you came to be inspired to write this book.
All right, I'll get started with that. I've been working in the area of the Middle East and North Africa, as well as Afghanistan, by the way, since the 1980s. I was born in Iran, became active in the student movement, and began thinking about how revolutions in Iran and Afghanistan had turned out so very differently, especially for women. So my interest in comparative studies and in women's rights began then. And I published some papers on the subject after I earned a PhD in 1986. As you noted, Dan, my professional career has included actually two stints with the UN. And during the first, when I was based in Helsinki, Finland, I wrote my first book, Modernizing Women, Gender and Social Change in the Middle East, which was first published in 1993, and the third edition came out in 2013. And in that book examines how women were involved in and affected by various social change processes, economic development, revolutions, Islamist movements, socio-demographic changes in 8 MENA countries, plus Afghanistan. So subsequently, as part of my interest in women's movements and in globalization, I began to study what I came to call transnational feminist networks. And I wrote a book on the subject. And then I contributed several articles and book chapters on that subject. And before Shamiran and I embarked on our Arab Spring book, I had another book, Globalization and Social Movements, Islamism, Feminism, and the Global Justice Movement. And the third edition, came out last year, just at the start of the pandemic, alas. And it includes a chapter on populist movements and the implications for democracy. And at Northeastern, I teach courses in social movements, women in world politics, and Middle East politics.
Thanks, Val. How about you, Shamiran?
Thank you so much. Good to be with you this morning. I think much of my interest in the project certainly touches on themes I explore both in the book and outside the book in other works that I've either published or I'm working on, including a book manuscript on ethnic conflict in Iraq. And I think before I had met Val around 2014, 2015, I was really interested in mapping out trajectories, especially in relation to foreign influence in the Arab uprisings. And at the time I was working on a project kind of collecting data across countries that have experienced specifically military interventions in the uprisings. And I was focusing both on a regional dimension and on the international dimension of these responses to the uprisings. And at the same time, I was kind of picking up on this continuation of various forms of influence that had really struck me as important dimensions for how things were unfolding about 5-6 years after the initial wave of late 2010, early 2011. And I became really interested in the ways in which both regional and international actors were in some ways facilitating repression and at the same time stifling, the transitions that we were seeing in places like Bahrain and in the more, violent cases that we saw unfold over the past 10 years in places like Syria, Libya, and Yemen that had descended into these kind of international and civil wars. And as a political scientist, much of that relates to much kind of broader questions that I tackle in my research on Iraq and elsewhere, that looks at foreign interventions, U.S. foreign policy towards the region, ethnic fractionalization and conflict, and then some of the solutions, which I guess we're going to be talking about, that have been proposed by, Western states in the way of democracy promotion in these kind of post-conflict settings relating to state building, peace building, and so on. And so the project kind of gained my interest in that sense, and it's a theme that we focus on throughout the book.
So we're going to talk about some of the individual countries later on, but just to start us off, could you give us a very high-level snapshot of, we're just past the 10-year anniversary of the beginning of the Arab Spring. How did it all start? Why and how did it spread? And 10 years later, where are those countries today?
Well, the protests began in Tunisia in December 2010, following the self-immolation of a young man after he was unable to ply his trade on the streets of his hometown, as he did not have the license to do so. So protests began first locally, then spread across Tunisia, especially when Tunisia's large and powerful trade union, the UGTT, organized strikes and protests, which were then joined by tens of thousands of peaceful protesters across the country. And the demands were for jobs, bread, and dignity. The protest precipitated a governance crisis, which led to the collapse of the government of President Zain al-Abidine Ben Ali, who had been in place since 1989. The Tunisian protests then diffused to Egypt, which similarly saw huge protests in Cairo, Alexandria, and elsewhere, followed by another governance crisis and the collapse of the regime of President Hosni Mubarak, who had been in power since 1981. Protests then spread across the region, enveloping Libya, Morocco, Bahrain, Syria, and Yemen. There were other countries that saw protests too, like Algeria and Morocco, but nowhere near as large and consequential as the 7 countries that we deal with in the book. I should say that the speed and scope of the Arab protests have been compared to those in Eastern Europe in 1989, but there are big differences. And earlier to protests that precipitated the so-called third wave democratic transitions. Portugal, Greece, Spain in the mid-1970s, Philippines and South Korea, in the early to mid-1980s, and around the same time in Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. The Arab Spring protests also have been compared to the much earlier 1848 revolutions in Europe, which came to be known, by the way, the springtime of the peoples, but which, similarly had very modest outcomes. We pose this central question: why were some, but not all, of the Arab mass social protests of 2011, why were they not accompanied by relatively quick and nonviolent outcomes in the direction of regime change, democracy, and social transformation, such as had occurred earlier? Why was a democratic transition limited to Tunisia? And why did region-wide democratization not occur? Shamiran has already touched on one or two of the issues that we deal with, and she and I will be unpacking those issues a little bit more. But just to, again, give you another overview, or our audience an overview, our book deals with the 7 countries that we feel were most affected by the Arab uprisings: Tunisia, Egypt, Morocco, Bahrain, Libya, Syria, and Yemen. And we apply an explanatory framework of 4 variables to discuss the very divergent outcomes from this procedural democratic transition and bargains that occurred in Tunisia to the internationalized civil conflicts and failed states in Libya, Syria, and Yemen. We examine the state and political institutions, civil society, women's status and movements, and the nature of international influences. Those are our 4 variables, our explanatory variables. So our framework takes into account domestic and geopolitical factors and forces, and we show how our 4 variables interacted to account for both causes and outcomes.
So you point to Tunisia as one of the at least partial success stories following the Arab Spring, and you make the case that really it was the degree of women's involvement with civil society and in the conversation that made a significant difference. Can you tell us more about this?
Unlike most books on the Arab Spring protests, ours includes a feminist perspective that fully integrates the salience of women and gender issues in both causes and consequences. So we argue that the legal status and social positions of women before the uprising, including their capacity to organize and mobilize within civil society and in political society, and to influence public policy. These shaped the nature of the protest movements, whether they were violent or nonviolent, and their outcomes. And we also argue, based on our review of the broad literatures in political science and sociology, that women's advocacy and activist links to other actors within civil society and to allies in political parties and government agencies helps to deepen democratization. That's a key argument that we make in the book. And we make that argument on the basis of, in particular, the experience of Tunisia and to a certain degree, Morocco. So in our analysis of civil society and women's organizations across our 7 countries, we found strength, capacity, and autonomy only in Tunisia and Morocco. For example, Tunisia's 2 major women's rights organizations, Femmes Démocrates and Aftoud, emerged in the 1980s. They were legalized in 1989. They collaborated with various civil society organizations, the Human Rights League, the Lawyers Association, the major trade union, and left-wing political parties to achieve various goals, including free speech, free elections, and ending domestic and workplace violence. They were sort of fortunate in that the Ben Ali regime presented itself as a champion of women's rights. And so various reforms actually were possible in Tunisia in the 1990s and into the new century.
One of the organizations that you mentioned in the book is a National Dialogue Quartet, and this was a group that won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2015. Now, sometimes organizations, individuals who win the Peace Prize don't always fare so well after they've won it. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what it is that they did, why they were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and how are they still involved in the life of the country now?
Tunisia is going through a little bit of a political turmoil these days. And the civil society organizations and some of the political parties are taking different positions on the subject. We might come back to that in a moment if you want some more details on the current political situation. But there was a serious political crisis in Tunisia in the summer of 2013. 2 left-wing political leaders had been assassinated. And a large opposition movement formed with daily protests and demands that there be accountability, prosecution, and that the government resign. For civil society organizations, at the initiative of the major trade union, the UGTT. Now, the UGTT is very large, very influential, and has a great deal of legitimacy in the country. And it formed a coalition with 3 other civil society organizations. The Employers Organization, UTICA, which, by the way, was led by a woman, the Human Rights League, and the Bar Association. This group came to be known as the National Dialogue Quartet, and it played a major role in calming the political crisis in the summer of 2013. And as I said, 2 political leaders, Chokri Belaid and Mohamed Brahmi from the Front Populaire left-wing party, had been assassinated. And people were very angry about this. They felt that Ennahda, the Islamist party, which was leading a coalition government with 2 other, as it happens, secular parties, that they had encouraged and fostered the kind of environment in Tunisia that had emboldened militant and extremist Islamists who were harassing unveiled women harassing secularists and professors at university and disrupting artistic and cinema showings, and then finally who murdered these two political figures. So daily angry protests could have brought down the government and could have derailed the transition. It was at that point that the four civil society organizations at the instigation of the UJET came in to mediate and to come up with a solution to the crisis. The decision was that the government would continue to operate until the constitution was formed, and then it would resign. And the expectation was that this would happen in October of 2013. As it happened, the work wasn't done until January of 2014. At that point, the government did resign, and a new technocratic government led by Mehdi Joma'a came in and then prepared for the next election. So this was really a very, very impressive move on the part of four major civil society organizations in Tunisia, and for their ability to calm the storm and to enable the democratic transition to continue. They were rightly nominated for, and received the 2015 Nobel Peace Prize. And I think that they are a model for many countries, and not just in the region, and what role they will play in calming the current political situation, political turmoil in Tunisia is something that we can talk about later on. And I'm very curious to see, what they'll be doing. Yeah.
We're going to talk about some of the countries that have not fared as well. But before we do that, let's zoom out a little bit. There's a section in your book in which you discuss democratization movements from a global perspective, and you interact with some of the theorists. You go all the way back to John Stuart Mill. You talk about folks like Sam Huntington and Martin Lipset. Do you see some of these folks are arguing that there need to be certain preconditions in place in order for democracy to really take hold in a country? What's your take on this? How do you see this?
Dan, we absolutely agree with all the theorists, from John Stuart Mill to Samuel Huntington and to some of the others. Shamiran and I read a huge literature on this subject, and of course I had read that literature before for my previous book. And various scholars highlight one or another of these prerequisites or preconditions for what they might call sustained democracy, effective democracy, robust democracy, etc. So what are these? Rising educational attainment, the presence of large modern middle classes or large modern working classes, institutional development, and the participation of women with democratic aspirations. And of course, we discuss this at great length throughout our book in the various chapters. So we have come to the conclusion, and we make this argument in the book, and in this regard, we agree with democracy scholars such as Kristen Welzel and others, that successful democracies emerge from strong and healthy societies that include local authorities, political parties, trade unions, professional associations, and other civil society organizations with a commitment to citizenship rights. And, the presence of these preconditions then paves the way for the expansion and codification of deeper and more extensive rights for women, for minorities, for other excluded social actors through a rights-based model of state building. And that's what we saw emerging in Tunisia in 2011, 13, 12, 13, and 14. So, but we agree with scholars who, Jaworski, Welzel, and others, who state that modernization increases ordinary people's capabilities and willingness to struggle for, democratic freedom. So you have to have a certain base of, economic development, social structural development, and so on, because that then places more resources into the hands of ordinary people, enhancing their capacity for collective action, and to push for effective democracy, which is what we saw in Tunisia. But people must believe in freedoms, and this is important because there is a certain instrumentalist approach to democracy, whereby in certain surveys you will find public stating that they believe in democracy, they value democracy, they prefer democracy as a political system. But if you look at some of the responses to some of the other questions, such as what about equality for different types of Muslims, for non-Muslims, for Christian citizens, for Hindu citizens, etc., for women, equal rights for women, there will be some hesitancy there. And so this kind of more robust type of democracy is one in which people and their institutions believe in and are committed to civil rights, political rights, but also the socioeconomic rights and prosperity, which, by the way, is what the protesters in Tunisia and Morocco were calling for, and which they did not get, which is actually what precipitated the political turmoil and crisis in Tunisia. It was the fact that, yes, we had civil and political rights and liberties in Tunisia, but various governments, 10 years, were not able to respond to those initial demands for jobs and bread and dignity.
Yeah, I think to add to that as well is, while we agree with the literature, one of the other things that we point to that I think is central to our analysis is the fact that there are endogenous and exogenous factors and forces that also affect democratization trajectories. And I think oftentimes, from Lipset to Benjamin Moore to Samuel Huntington, there's such a strong emphasis on the domestic conditions and the ways in which they play out absent these external influences in the cases of Western Europe, North America, and so on. And so one of the things that we highlight is that to actually understand these developments of what happens in the region is that, sure, you have these mass protests and you do have people coalescing around very common grievances, socioeconomic, laggard socioeconomic development, lack of political representation, really repressive regimes. But at the same time, there are kind of the external environment has a pretty big role to play in how democratization plays out and determining which transitions become successful and which don't. And I think this is a salient factor that we look at, this kind of interaction between what's happening across the region and the kind of broader international factors and forces that affect, both democratic diffusion, but also sometimes kind of blocking democracy in that sense. And if we look at, foreign aid allocations, especially military aid that at times has trumped economic and social development aid, and especially we see this post 9/11, which we'll talk about a bit later. And I think this kind of is, in that way, sure that there are these important preconditions. But one of the things that we show in the book is that in the case of the MENA region, as as a region that has pretty robust history with external interference, think about 1953 coup and Operation Ajax in Iran, for example, where you have really kind of external factors and forces and states that at times actually impede democratization. And we see this happening on many different levels across the region. If we look at most notably places like Libya, Syria, and Yemen, you have these external interventions that actually, in many ways make the uprisings and their trajectory a lot more violent. That then leads to all sorts of civil wars, and in some cases, internationalized civil wars. But in other cases too, if we look at, as Val had mentioned, Tunisia, Morocco, and Egypt, where you didn't have these kind of pretty sustained and robust external meddling, but at the same time, through different ways and through different channels, both Western states, the United States and the EU, especially with its different neighborhood policies, have actually impeded democratization as well. And as that sort of leverage through aid, and especially through military aid, has had an impact on these transitions as well. And so this is one of the kind of things that we nuance in the book, in that sure, preconditions matter, and they're important. But in cases of the global south, you do have this external kind of leverage and impediment that changes what happens domestically, but also changes on a regional level some of the outcomes that we see.
So I want to move in a slightly different direction and open up a time capsule and take us back to 1997. 97 was a year that Fareed Zakaria published a piece in Foreign Affairs. It was about illiberal democracies. I'm going to quote from that article. He argues that in many parts of that world, referring to the Middle East and North Africa, such as Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt, and some of the Gulf states, were elections to be held tomorrow, the resulting regimes would almost certainly be more illiberal than the ones now in place. That was 1997. A lot has changed since then. Zakaria was depicting this tension between political participation on one hand, increased democratic participation versus civil rights, constitutional liberties, freedom of the press, human rights. Is this still a tension that you see in the region, and is it a profitable lens through which to view the countries that you're interacting with?
I think one of the things to think about, I assigned that essay, and we have, I have my students kind of rip it apart in some sense. I think there's something to be said about a more substantive emphasis on democracy, right? That you have democratic structures and governance that are there that protect, for example, civil liberties. Civil liberties include protection for minority rights, includes, things like a free media and things like that, and a lot kind of more substantive elements. But at the same time, I think one of the ways in which Zakaria falls short of kind of thinking about why we don't see this kind of mass diffusion of either democratization or democratic states in the region is really, if we think about the level of external interference and intervention. And that has been really crucial to both studying the history of autocracy in the region and its kind of stickiness in a sense, and at the same time has been part and parcel of how both EU member states, but also most notably the US, has leveraged all sorts of influence to kind of maintain these geostrategic interests in the region. And I think without taking, this is something that we had alluded to earlier, without thinking about this history, but also how the international environment really shapes whether or not democratization is possible, is something that's absent in that essay. And I think if we look especially in the history and trajectory of, for example, really militarized and coercive foreign aid allocations after 9/11, this picture becomes a lot clearer, right? Where you see, for example, increase in military aid to places like Morocco. Why? In response to this kind of mass migration crisis, forced migration crisis that ensues as a result of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And of course, with that, the kind of political instability and turmoil and the absence of security in places like Libya and Yemen and Syria that after 2011 increases this wave of forced migration. And so I think one of the ways in which we tackle that in the book is that you do have these preconditions, and these preconditions are certainly important. But one of the things that nuances and kind of acts as a counterfactual to that argument is the fact that you have pretty strong international forces that at times have subverted pro-democracy movements. And one of the kind of ways that I begin this question, certainly in my work, but also in the ways in which I teach it and teach that essay and reflect on that essay, is look what happens in 1953, right? In the coup against Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, where you have the first democratically elected government at the height of the Cold War that nationalizes the Iranian oil company, and that becomes a key strategic threat for Britain and the US. And what do you have? The CIA's first coup that successfully topples a foreign government, a democratically elected government, that then really for decades changes the trajectory of development in Iran, but at the same time actually changes and pivots American foreign policy both through covert action and kind of more direct action in how it engages with potential threats that arise from society, though they may be kind of democratic forces, but then may at the same time kind of undermine its interest, right? And so I think kind of caveating that with this counterfactual is really important for thinking about, sure, you have illiberal democracies, and democracy can't thrive without this kind of important dimension of respect for civil liberties, because that's what makes democracy substantive, right? It's not just a numbers game. But at the same time, there's this kind of dimension that's really important for thinking about how the region, the kind of robustness of authoritarianism and autocratic rule in the region in general.
So a couple final questions. There's always going to be a large number of organizations, governmental, non-governmental, that are interested in promoting democracy and human rights. 10 years after the Arab Spring, what lessons have we learned?
I think if we look at, for example, one of the things that we do in the book is we dig deep into this question of official development assistance, what it's been over the past 2 decades and how it changes, like from the 1990s into the kind of, and most notably in the early 2000s and after 9/11, in that there was an exponential amount of money that was donor allocated between the European Union to North African states, so Tunisia and Morocco most notably, but also foreign aid, as I just mentioned, between Egypt and the United States. And when we look at this kind of both the changing nature of foreign aid allocations, as well as the kind of outcomes that we see of foreign aid spending over the past couple of decades, is that we really don't see much in terms of foreign aid as having a positive effect on changing socioeconomic conditions for citizens across the region. And Aaron Schneider has kind of touched on this question of why foreign aid and democracy promotion programs haven't worked. And much of that reflects both the lack of conditionality in constraining how regimes kind of co-opt and use foreign aid allocation, but also this kind of growing emphasis on securitized aid, especially after 9/11, which changes both the nature of aid and the ways in which it's allocated, but also changes these kind of bilateral partnerships with key autocrats in the region that then continue to kind of act as guardians of keeping Islamists at bay, of keeping migration at bay, and really in some ways subverting and suppressing dissident movements that were emerging from society in response to laggard socioeconomic development and other factors. And so in many ways, foreign aid didn't do much for the region except sustain, these repressive regimes hold on power. And at the same time, a prime example of that is the coup in Egypt in 2013, right? The Obama administration withholds aid, and there was a lot of hope that would continue in a way of pushing the military to reinstate civilian rule. That doesn't happen over a 1-year time period. And foreign aid is then reinstated in 2014 and 2015, right? The same kind of aid allocations that had gone to Egypt. And it signaled that at the end of the day, these securitized interests and securing, geostrategic kind of spheres of influence, both by the EU and the United States as the 2 largest donor bodies in the region, really doesn't change. And doesn't change, it doesn't reflect the kind of societal forces that are challenging these regimes that these countries have a lot of leverage and sway with.
One final question for both of you, and that's, what questions are you not being asked that we should be asking? What questions have I not asked? What questions are other folks not asking about your book that perhaps we actually should all be talking about?
One of the questions that actually you did pose, which I thought was, and I think both of us thought was, was very a very pertinent one, had to do with the article that Thomas Friedman wrote recently about Mother Nature, but also about youth. Mother Nature certainly is a factor in the travails of the region, as it has been throughout the globe, including Louisiana and other parts of the United States. And hence we have, this climate summit going on in Scotland as we speak. Parts of the Middle East and North Africa region, which were always hot in the long summer months, are now seeing extreme rising temperatures that are now absolutely intolerable. But it's a region that, because of some of the issues that we discuss in the book, because of some of the issues that Shamiran was just talking about as well, the countries that should be cooperating with each other with respect to sharing water and other depleting resources are not doing so. And the region is the least internally integrated of any world region in terms of trade, cooperation, etc., other than within the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. Climate change has certainly adversely affected the region, and oil extraction has been a major culprit. There are some green projects here and there in Morocco and Iran, for example, but nothing substantial. And meanwhile, what's going on in Israel? Israel is carrying out deep sea exploration for oil and gas off its Mediterranean shore. So, I'm hoping that the ongoing climate summit in Scotland might finally bring about some real commitments, because that hasn't been the case before. But there was also this question of the youth bulge. And there was a great deal of discussion about the youth bulge at the time of the protests back in 2011. That, in other words, all this sort of backlog of fertility increases had resulted in this huge population of young people, and they were without jobs and they were without prospects, and therefore you had these protests. It was a little bit like the anti-war, analogy would be the anti-war, the baby boom generation in the United States and the anti-war protests of the 1960s. But the youth bulge is changing. There is no longer a real youth bulge in the region, and certainly not in the same way that we saw it happening in 2011. It is a less salient factor in the region's political fortunes, although young people are still largely, they have very high rates of unemployment. But the socio-demographic profile is changing in the region in all but just a handful of countries, with higher age at first marriage, much lower fertility, in fact, quite declining fertility at replacement levels, and in some parts of Iran, below replacement levels. So this means that in the near future, there will be a smaller population of employed and salaried people who can then care for the growing elderly population. And we see these trends in Iran, Lebanon, Turkey, Tunisia, and Qatar. And in Iran, in fact, only 10 years ago, the authorities ended the state-funded family planning program, which had contributed to declining fertility rates and smaller family size through the provision of seminars and training and free contraceptives and so on and so forth. So there is an environmental movement in some of the countries, in Iran and Tunisia, but and maybe we will see the equivalent of a sunrise or even an extinction rebellion movement in some of the countries, but we're not there yet.
Val, Shamiran, thanks again for being with us today, and congrats on this remarkable book. Again, it's After the Arab Uprising, Progress and Stagnation in the Middle East and North Africa, published this year by Cambridge University Press. Thanks, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much for having us on.
Yeah.